Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. No wisdom candle while I'm traveling. Reminder, I'm traveling tomorrow. Back home, please God. I should arrive in peace and in one piece. So no class tomorrow. Tomorrow is a travel day for me. So our next class after today will be Thursday. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Melissa in Great Neck, Lucy, Minnesota. Bella in Florida. Bella in Texas. Bill in mid-Missouri. Joe in the Inland Empire. Shandora in the Bronx County, Northern California. Renee in Indiana. Lorraine in Texas. Esther in Texas. Sharon in New Jersey, Paula in the Great Northwest, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Nancy in North Carolina, Marie in Freeport, Marie in Freeport, Norman in Ohio, and Abelvito in Panama. Welcome everybody. I apologize that I was late. You know, every day I broadcast to YouTube and Facebook. I also record the class in this camera system with a micro SD card. And I think these things just wear out after a while. I've had to replace a few. This particular one, like it just stops recording for some reason. And usually when I take it out and put it back in, it resets. I tried that over and over and over again before it finally worked. And now it just stopped, so I'll have to download the video at a slightly lower resolution. Whatever. My problems are not that interesting. But I apologize for being late. Okay, so we're opening a new chapter. New chapter, chapter 10 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Hold on a second. Everything is just a little bit screwy. There we go. The 29th volume of the Talmud. Our daf tonight is page 89. So we're opening Mishna number 1. It's a short Mishnah. We should get to Mishnah number 2 as well here in chapter 10. And I feel like tonight's page is going to be more accessible than so much of this tractate has. We're still talking about offerings, animal offerings, sacrificial offerings that haven't been brought in 2,000 years. But rather than focusing on what disqualifies the offerings and the technicalities of the offerings, which has often been a little bit challenging, tonight we're talking about precedence of the offerings, meaning if you have to bring two offerings, which one do you bring first, right? Relative importance of the different offerings. And in order to give an answer, to judge why one offering would come before another, the sages have to answer the question, what makes one offering more important than another? What makes one offering somehow more valuable, or at least that it simply gets precedence, that it needs to come first? And I find these questions and this analysis fascinating, and I hope you will too. Okay, so chapter 10, Mishnah number 1. Any offering that is more frequent than another precedes the other offering. Therefore, the daily offerings precede the additional offerings, right? The Musaf, like when we do the Musaf prayer on Saturday, or the Musaf prayer on Rosh Chodesh, the first day of a Hebrew month, right? We have a Musaf Amida. Musaf means additional, right? So we have the daily prayers, and then there's additional prayers. There's an additional prayer for Sabbath. There's an additional prayer for Rosh Chodesh. There's additional prayers for the holidays. And the prayers, the daily prayer services, that they are obligatory for all Jews, has replaced the offering system, the sacrificial system, right? So there's the morning offerings have been replaced by the morning prayers. The afternoon offerings have been replaced by the afternoon prayers. Now, Jews were praying even while the temple stood, but the prayers have acquired a much more central role in Judaism, in Jewish life, than they had when the temple was standing. Now that we cannot achieve atonement, we cannot achieve a kind of coming close to God, and the word for an offering is a korban, which means coming near. So since we can't kind of come near to God by bringing offerings, we do it through prayer. And so when we say that the daily offerings take precedence over the additional or the musaf offerings, we're also saying that the daily prayers take precedence over the additional prayers, right? And indeed, we say the daily prayers before we say the additional prayers. Now, it sounds like, what's the big deal, Sal? But it's actually, if you think about it, counterintuitive, right? You would think that things that come along only once in a while are more special than things that happen every day. But actually, when we have two things to do, and one is the everyday prayer, and the other is the occasional prayer, either the weekly prayer of the Sabbath, or the monthly prayer of Rosh Chodesh, or the yearly, only once a year, additional prayer of Pesach, or Shavuos, or Sukkot, or Rosh Hashanah. When we have those kinds of choices, the daily prayer comes first. And I think that's an incredibly important and beautiful spiritual teaching, that which we do every day takes precedence over that which we do occasionally. If you think about where's our spiritual growth going to come from, it's going to be that daily work, right? So I think spiritually speaking, that's why the daily prayers have precedence over the less frequent prayers. Now, that's not going to be the actual proof. There's a source in the Torah, a source in the text, why we do it that way. But I think that the lesson nevertheless stands. Okay, so therefore the daily offerings precede the additional offerings, which are sacrificed only on certain days. When Shabbos and the new moon coincide, the additional Shabbos offerings come before the additional new moon offerings of the new month. And likewise, the additional new moon offerings precede the additional new year offerings, meaning when we have the musaf of a new month, it's going to precede the musaf of a new year. The Mishnah cites the source for the principle that the frequent precedes the less frequent. As it is stated with regard to the additional offerings of the first day of Passover, Numbers 28:23, quote, "Besides the burnt offering of the morning, which is for a daily burnt offering, you shall offer these." And the verse indicates that the daily offering is sacrificed first. So that's your home address in the Torah for that, why that which is daily comes before that which is less frequent than daily. All right? The verse indicates that the daily offering is sacrificed first, and then the additional offerings are sacrificed. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive the principle that the frequent precedes the less frequent? The Gemara expresses puzzlement at this question. From where do we derive this? One must say that the reason is stated in the Mishnah that we just read, which says that it is derived from the verse, besides the burnt offering of the morning. Right? So the Gemara explains, if that verse is the only source, one might have thought that perhaps it is only the daily offerings that precede additional offerings because they are far more frequent, as they are sacrificed daily. But how do we know that something, when there's a competition, so to speak, a conflict, a question, are we going to bring the weekly musaf offering of Shabbos before or after the monthly musaf offering of Rosh Chodesh? Then which one goes first? Neither one is daily. So what is the source for something that the fact that something which comes weekly will go before something that goes monthly? That's not necessarily emerging from that verse that we just read about daily offerings. That's what the question they're asking. So with regard to the precedence of a relatively frequent additional offering over a relatively less frequent additional offering, right, that Shabbos Musaf is going to precede Rosh Chodesh Musaf, the question arises, from where do we derive this? So Rabbi Ilya said that it is derived from the fact that the verse states with regard to the additional offerings of Passover in Numbers 28-24, the next verse after our proof text, like these you shall offer daily for 7 days. So this verse, which immediately follows the one cited previously, indicates that the principle that governs these additional offerings shall be like the principle governing those daily offerings and additional offerings mentioned previously, i.e., that the more frequent precedes the less frequent. And that indeed is the law that we follow. So the Gemara challenges this, but what verse is required to teach its own, but that verse is required to teach its own law, that the additional offerings of the first day of Passover recur on each day of Passover. So the Gemara answers, if so, let the verse write, these you shall offer daily, since the Torah writes, like these, both the law that these additional offerings are brought on each day of Passover when the temple is standing, and the principle concerning precedence can be derived from this verse. Now, the Gemara rejects this suggestion and says, if the verse had written only, these you shall offer daily for 7 days, I would say that these offerings mentioned in the previous verse are sacrificed in total over the 7 days. Therefore, the Torah writes, like these, to teach that they are all sacrificed each day. So the Gemara counters that interpretation is not possible, as the phrase, you shall offer daily, is written in the verse, which indicates that these offerings are sacrificed on each of the 7 days. So the Gemara, arguing with itself, rebuts and says, and still one can say that these specific offerings are required for the first day, but with regard to other days, I do not know how many offerings are to be sacrificed. Therefore, the term like these is needed to teach this. Therefore, it cannot be used for the principle that relatively frequent additional offerings precede relatively less frequent additional offerings. So the Gemara answers, that interpretation is also not possible, as the verse states, you shall offer, ta'asu, indicating that all the sacrificial rites, asiyot, on all the days of Passover should be equal. Therefore, the term like these is in fact superfluous, and it can be cited as the source for this principle that things that, for example, occur weekly are going to happen, are going to be brought before those which happen monthly. Abaye said the application of the principle of precedence to all frequent offerings can be derived from the verse itself, cited in the Mishna. And the reason is that if so, that only the daily offerings precede less frequent offerings, then the verse could say merely, beside the burnt offering of the morning, and remain silent from the rest of the verse, and we would know to bring the daily offering first. Why do I need the additional phrase, which is for a daily burnt offering? This serves to say, this serves to say this offering that is more frequent, i.e. any more frequent, should precede anything that is less frequent. And that is the law that we follow. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 10. Mishnah 2. Everything working? Yeah. Double checking something here on my computer.
Of the morning, and remain silent from the rest of the verse, and we would boom.
Okay. Mishnah 2. Any offering that is more sacred than another precedes the other offering. Okay, so when we had 2 offerings to bring, Mishnah 1 taught us that the one that is a more frequently brought offering will come first. When you had to choose between 2, the one that is more frequent comes first. Okay, now let's say that these are not regular offerings at all. Now we're just talking about offerings that people bring, not communal offerings that are brought every day, but rather, let's say, sin offerings and burnt offerings. Now, which one is good? The priest has a choice. Is he going to bring a sin offering first or a burnt offering first? A sin offering or a peace offering first? Which one is going to come first? So any offering that is more sacred than another precedes the other. Okay, more sacred is the principle of Mishnah 2. The Mishnah elaborates, if there is blood of a sin offering and blood of a burnt offering to be presented on the altar, the blood of the sin offering precedes the blood of the burnt offering because it affects acceptance, meaning atonement for severe transgressions that are punishable by chorus. Likewise, if there are limbs of a burnt offering and portions of a sin offering to be burnt on the altar, right? So first we're comparing the blood of a sin offering to the blood of a burnt offering. The blood of the sin offering affects atonement for the person, the owner of that offering. Burnt offerings are not for atonement. They can fulfill a vow, or they can just be an expression of praise and thanks from the person. Now we're not comparing, but it's the blood, right, that affects either the atonement or the fulfillment of the vow. Now we're talking about the flesh of the offering, right? So when you talk about a burnt offering, all of its flesh is burned on the altar. When you talk about a sin offering, some of its flesh is burned on the altar, and the rest of it is eaten by the priests. So now when you have a priest has a choice, which is he going to bring to the altar first? The flesh of a burnt offering or the flesh of a sin offering? It's going to be the opposite result. Likewise, if there are limbs of a burnt offering and portions of a sin offering to be burned on the altar, the burning of the limbs of the burnt offering precedes the portions of the sin offering, because the burnt offering is entirely burned in the flames on the altar, whereas only part of the sin offering is burned. Similarly, although both affect atonement, a sin offering precedes, comes before. A sin offering precedes a guilt offering due to the fact that its blood is placed on the four corners of the altar, and the remnants of its blood are poured on the base of the altar, whereas the blood of the guilt offering is sprinkled on only two corners of the altar. A guilt offering precedes a thanks offering and the ram of a nazir due to the fact that it is an offering of the most sacred order, and the others are offerings of lesser sanctity. A thanks offering and the ram of a nazir come before a peace offering due to the fact that they are eaten for 1 day, like the offerings of the most sacred order, whereas a peace offering is eaten for 2 days. And the thanks offering and the ram of the nazir require loaves to be brought with them, 4 types with the thanks offering and 2 types with the ram of the nazir. Sacrifice of the peace offering comes before sacrifice of the bechor, the firstborn male animal of a female kosher domesticated animal. The peace offering precedes the sacrifice of the bechor due to the fact that the peace offering requires placing the blood on the altar in the form of 2 placements that are 4, and placing hands on the head of the offering, and libations which accompany it, and the wavings of the breast and the thigh by the priest and the owner, none of which is required for the bechor. The bechor offering comes before the animal tithe offering because it is sanctified from the womb. As soon as the male offspring is born of this female animal, it is a bechor that is destined for sacrifice. Unlike the animal tithe offering, it does not require consecration, and it is eaten by priests, the bechor is, whereas the animal tithe is eaten by its owners, right? Everyone may partake of the animal tithe offering. The animal tithe offering precedes bird offerings due to the fact that it requires slaughtering, whereas the bird is killed through malika, the pinching of the neck by the priest's thumb fingernail. And there are 2 elements of the animal tithe offering that have the status of offerings of the most sacred order: its blood that is presented on the altar, and its portions that are burned on the altar. Whereas with regard to bird offerings, only the blood is presented on the altar. The bird offerings precede meal offerings, which are made of wheat flour, due to the fact that they are types whose blood is presented and atonement is effected by the blood. The meal offering of a sinner precedes a voluntary meal offering due to the fact that it comes to atone for a sin. And for the same reason, the sacrifice of a bird sin offering precedes the sacrifice of the bird burnt offering. And likewise, with regard to its consecration, the sin offering takes precedence. And that is Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 10. We move on to page 89b and the Gemara of Mishnah 2. The Mishnah teaches that the placement of the blood of a sin offering precedes the sprinkling of the blood of a burnt offering, whereas the burning of the limbs of a burnt offering precedes the burning of the portions of a sin offering. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? And the Gemara answers, this is as the sages taught in a Baraisa discussing a verse about the consecration of the Levites. Right? When the Levites were initially consecrated in the wilderness, they would not receive land once the children of Israel entered the land of Israel. Rather, the Levites, their portion would be God, and God would be their portion. They would serve in sort of priestly educational matters. The priests came from among the Levites. The Levites, not all Levites are priests. All priests are Levites. But Levites would regularly serve in the Holy Temple. They would be the musicians in the temple. And they had a kind of, rabbinic, clergy-like role to play in ancient Israel. And they had the Levitical cities, right, which included the cities of refuge. All of this they would have, and they would receive a tithe from the people, but what they would not get is land. And so the Levites might have farms that they purchased, but generally speaking, they were involved in other activities, whereas everyone else received land. Okay, so when the Levites assumed this sacred role on behalf of the nation, when the Torah was first given, they were consecrated to that role. When Moses, with the help of Aaron, actually waived all of the Levites, thousands and thousands of them. We don't know exactly what that looked like, but there was a ritual and a ceremony by which the Levitical tribe, and I'm a Levite, so when my tribe was consecrated to its holy duty. So from where are these matters derived? The Gemara answers, this is as the sages taught in a brisa discussing a verse about the consecration of the Levites in Numbers 8:8. Then let them take a young bull and its meal offering, fine flour mingled with oil, and a second young bull you shall take for a sin offering. So the brisa explains, if this verse comes to teach that they are two bulls, well, we already know this, as it is already stated in Numbers 8:12, and offer the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. So why must the verse state, a second young bull you shall take for a sin offering? As one might have thought that the sin offering should precede all the rites of the burnt offering. Therefore, the verse states, a second young bull you shall take for a sin offering after the burnt offering. And this teaches that the sin offering actually comes second to the burnt offering when we're talking about the flesh being consumed on the altar pyre. The brisa continues, if the verse had stated only that the sin offering is the second bull, one might have thought that the burnt offering precedes the sin offering with regard to all its rites, and the blood of a burnt offering would be brought before the blood of a sin offering. Therefore, the verse states, and offer the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, indicating that the sin offering precedes the burnt offering. How do we reconcile the verses? The placement of the blood of the sin offering precedes the sprinkling of the blood of the burnt offering because it affects acceptance, whereas the burnt offering does not affect atonement, and the burning of the limbs of the burnt offering on the altar precedes the burning of the portions of the sin offering in fulfillment of the phrase, and the second young bull you shall take for a sin offering. So the Gemara asks, but why do all four placements of the blood of the sin offering precede the sprinkling of the blood of the burnt offering? Why not just say, we will take the first placement of the blood of the sin offering, which affects atonement, let that take precedence, then we'll do the placements of the burnt offering blood, and then come back to the sin offering blood. Why are you going to do all the placements of the sin offering before all the placements of a burnt offering when it's one priest and he has to choose which he's going to do first? And so the answer is, Ravina said, in the verse here, we are dealing with the sin offering brought by the Levites for their consecration, one time in history. And even though it does not affect atonement and is therefore comparable to a burnt offering, the Merciful One states the sin offering precedes the burnt offering with regard to the presentation of the blood. And this indicates that in general, all four placements of the blood of a sin offering precede the sprinkling of the blood of the burnt offering, despite the fact that only the first placement actually affects atonement. And in the West, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, they say there is another answer. Once the priest commenced with the placements of the blood of the sin offering, he completes all of them before sprinkling the blood of the burnt offering. Meaning, before he moves on to another offering, he does the whole job of the first offering, which certainly makes common sense, but here we have the proof as well. New topic. A dilemma was raised before the sages if there is blood of a sin offering and limbs of a burnt offering to be sacrificed, which of them precedes the other? Right? We said the blood of a sin offering precedes the blood of a burnt offering, and the flesh of a burnt offering precedes the flesh of a sin offering. Okay, what about if it's the blood of the sin offering versus the flesh of the burnt offering? one priest, he has to choose which one to do first. Which is he going to do? Does the blood of the sin offering take precedence due to the fact that it affects acceptance? Or perhaps the limbs of the burnt offering take precedence due to the fact that they are entirely burned in the flames of the altar? Which principle is more important? So the Gemara suggests, coming here, as the Mishnah teaches that the blood of a sin offering precedes the blood of a burnt offering, and one can infer from this that the blood of the sin offering does not precede all elements of the burnt offering. It is only with regard to the blood of the burnt offering that it takes precedence, whereas it does not take precedence with regard to the limbs of the burnt offering. So that would seem to indicate that the flesh of the burnt offering is going to be brought before the blood of the sin offering. But the Gemara is immediately going to reject that proof. Now, if I was just guessing here off the top of my head, and I don't recall what I read a little earlier today, wouldn't you say that the blood of the sin offering is going to precede the flesh of the burnt offering simply because the blood of a sin offering, the blood of a burnt offering precedes the flesh of the burnt offering, right? When you bring a burnt offering, its blood goes on the altar first, and then its flesh is brought up on top for the altar pyre. And since the blood of the sin offering precedes the blood of the burnt offering, A to B, B to C, you would think that the blood of the sin offering precedes the flesh of the burnt offering. Let's see if that's what it was. So the Gemara rejects the proof I just gave a moment ago. On the contrary, the opposite conclusion can be inferred from the latter clause of the Mishnah, which teaches that limbs of a burnt offering precede the portions of the sin offering consumed on the altar. This indicates that it is only with regard to the portions of the sin offering consumed on the altar that the limbs of the burnt offering take precedence, but they do not take precedence with regard to the blood of the sin offering. Therefore, the blood of the sin offering comes before the flesh of the burnt offering. And the Gemara concludes, rather, no inference is to be learned from this Mishnah concerning this matter. The question has actually not yet been answered. Let's see. Where did the law end up? If there is blood of a sin offering and limbs of a burnt offering to be sacrificed, or blood of a burnt offering to be sprinkled and sacrificial portions of a sin offering to be burned, or blood of a burnt offering and blood of a guilt offering to be sprinkled, one may sacrifice whichever he wishes first. So the order of precedence was never established. So my logical answer sounded nice, but is not the actual answer. The actual answer is the priest can choose whichever one he wants to bring first. Okay, a dilemma was raised before the sages. If there is blood of a burnt offering to be sprinkled and portions of a sin offering to be burned, which of them precedes the other? Right now, blood of a burnt offering versus portions of the sin offering. We just heard the answer a moment ago. We had the preview. Does the blood of the burnt offering take precedence as it comes from an offering that is burned in its entirety on the altar? Or perhaps the portions of the sin offering to be burned take precedence because they come from an offering that affects atonement? Now we're going to try the same two proofs that are not going to work. Right? The Gemara suggests, come and hear, as the Mishnah teaches that the blood of the sin offering precedes the blood of the burnt offering. And one could infer that it's the blood of the sin offering that precedes the blood of the burnt offering, but the portions of the sin offering to be burned do not take precedence. And the Gemara rejects that proof and says, on the contrary, we draw the opposite conclusion from the latter clause of the Mishnah, which teaches that the limbs of the burnt offering precede the portions of the sin offering that are consumed on the altar, which indicates that it is only the limbs of the burnt offering that precede the portions of the sin offering that are burned, but the blood of the burnt offering does not. And so the Gemara again concludes, rather, no inference is to be learned in this Mishnah concerning this dilemma. There was no answer. It's not even teku. It's just there is no answer, and that's why the priest can choose whichever one he wants. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If there is blood of a burnt offering and blood of a guilt offering to be sprinkled on the altar, which one of them takes precedence? Does the blood of the burnt offering take precedence? Or as it comes from an offering that is burned in its entirety? Or perhaps the blood of the guilt offering takes precedence since it affects atonement? Come in here, the Mishnah teaches that the blood of the sin offering precedes the blood of the burnt offering, but the blood of the guilt offering does not precede the blood of the burnt offering. So by right, the Mishnah should have taught the law with regard to the blood of a guilt offering, but it didn't. So one could then have inferred, if it had, by right, the Mishnah should have taught the law with regard to the blood of a guilt offering. One could then have inferred that the blood of a sin offering, which takes precedence over the blood of the guilt offering, also precedes the blood of the burnt offering. But since the Mishnah wants to teach the latter clause, that the burning of the limbs of the burnt offering precedes the portions of the sin offering, it also mentions a sin offering in the former clause. And the Gemara explains why the latter clause had to mention a sin offering rather than a guilt offering. As had the Mishnah taught this principle of the latter clause with regard to the portions of a guilt offering, I would say that it is only the portions of a guilt offering over which the limbs of a burnt offering take precedence, but they do not take precedence over the portions of a sin offering, as a sin offering is of a greater sanctity than a guilt offering. Due to this reason, the Mishnah in the former clause also taught the principle with regard to a sin offering, and therefore one cannot infer from this that the law does not apply to the guilt offering. We don't know where the guilt offering comes in the order of precedence. So the Gemara suggests come and hear, as the Mishnah states, that a sin offering precedes a guilt offering. So we can infer from this that it is only a sin offering that precedes a guilt offering, but a burnt offering does not. And what, is the Mishnah not referring to the sprinkling of the blood, which would indicate that the blood of a burnt offering does not precede the blood of a guilt offering? But the Gemara rejects this explanation. No, it is referring to the precedence of the sacrificial portions consumed on the altar. And the Gemara adds that the language of the Mishnah is also precise in this regard, as it teaches that the sin offering takes precedence due to the fact that its blood is placed on the four corners of the altar, rather than simply teaching it is placed on the four corners of the altar, as would have been taught had it been speaking of the blood. One can therefore conclude from the statement of the Mishnah that its subject is the sacrificial portions burned on the altar, not the blood. Now, new topic, the Mishnah teaches a sin offering precedes a guilt offering due to the fact that its blood is placed on the four corners of the altar and the remainder of its blood is poured on the base of the altar. So the Gemara challenges this and says, on the contrary, the guilt offering should precede the sin offering, as it has a fixed minimum value of 2 shekels, as stated in the Torah in Leviticus 5:15, whereas the sin offering has no minimum value. Now the Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the sin offering requires more placements of the blood on the altar than the guilt offering elevates its importance and teaches us that the sin offering is of a higher sanctity than the guilt offering. The Mishnah further teaches that a guilt offering precedes a thanks offering and the ram of a Nazir. Recall that a Nazir is one who takes a vow for a certain amount of time to abstain from any product of the grapevine, including wine, also to not cut his hair, and to not become impure for the dead for the length of his vow. And then if he completes his term of Nazirus, he has to bring certain offerings, including the ram of the Nazir, before he can resume his old life and drink wine or wine vinegar, get haircuts, etc. Samson was a lifelong Nazir. Because the Mishnah further teaches that a guilt offering precedes a thanks offering and the ram of the Nazir due to the fact that it is an offering of the most sacred order. The thanks offering and the ram of a Nazir are not offerings of the highest sanctity. The Gemara challenges, on the contrary, the thanks offering and the Nazir's ram should precede the guilt offering, as they have accompanying requirements, namely the loaves, right? There are loaves that come with, loaves of bread, that come with a thanks offering and the ram of a Nazir that do not accompany a guilt offering. The Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the guilt offering is an offering of the most sacred order means it is more important than the thanks offering or the Nazir's ram. The Mishnah teaches that a thanks offering and the ram of the Nazir precede a peace offering due to the fact that they are eaten for only one day, right? The day they're sacrificed and that night, whereas a peace offering has a longer deadline. You can eat it this day, the night after the day it's brought, and the whole following day before it becomes too late to partake, for the owners to eat of that peace offering. It has a longer deadline. Wait a minute. Now, the Gemara challenges that ruling and says, on the contrary, peace offerings should precede the thanks offering and the ram of the Nazir, as they are offered by the community as well as the individual, right? There are communal peace offerings and there are individual peace offerings. Anything that's communal tends to be of a higher importance than something that is individual. A communal peace offering is sacrificed on the festival of Shavuos, but there is no communal thanks offering nor any communal ram of Nazir. And the Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the thanks offering and the ram of the Nazir are eaten for only one day indicates that they are of greater importance. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If there is a thanks offering and a ram of a Nazir to be sacrificed, which of them precedes the other? They've been brought sort of as a pair in terms of level of sanctity. Well, what if we had to do a thanks offering versus a ram of a Nazir? Then which one comes first? So does the thanks offering take precedence, as it requires 4 types of loaves, whereas the ram of the Nazir requires only 2? Or perhaps the ram of the Nazir takes precedence, as there are other offerings whose blood is placed on the altar together with the ram of the Nazir. Right? When a Nazir is required to sacrifice a burnt offering and a sin offering, as well as a ram when he completes his Naziris. And the Gemara answers, come in here, a Baraisa that explicitly discusses this case. This offering precedes that offering. As this offering, i.e. the thanks offering, requires 4 types of loaves, and that offering, the ram of the Nazir, requires only 2 types. So the thanks offering comes first. The Mishnah teaches that the peace offering precedes the Bechor, due to the fact that the peace offering requires 2 placements of the blood on the altar, which are 4, right? So the catty corner opposite corners, where you're actually going to hit 2 sides of the altar and then go to the diagonally opposite corner. And at that corner, you're going to hit 2 sides of the altar. So it's 2 placements that are 4. And the placement of hands, semicha, the placement of hands of the owner and the priest on the animal's head, and libations that come with it, wine libations, and the special procedure called the waving of the breast and thigh. And the Gemara challenges, whereas for the Bechor, we don't do all those other things. And the Gemara challenges is, on the contrary, the sacrifice of the Bechor should precede the peace offering, as it is sanctified from the womb, and it is eaten only by priests, whereas a peace offering may be eaten by non-priests. And the Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the additional mitzvahs are performed in the case of the peace offering makes it a sacrifice of greater importance than the Bechor. Now, the Mishnah went on and said that the Bechor offering precedes the animal tithe offering. Right? Animal tithe is people who, were shepherds and owned flocks. Every year, they would collect all of the newborn sheep or goats of that year, put them in a pen, and pass them under the rod. And every 10th animal would be designated as an animal tithe. Similar to the tithing process of crops, but this is about animals. So every 10th animal of the newborns of that year would be designated to be an animal tithe offering, and the owner would take them up to Jerusalem at some point, and they would sacrifice them in the temple. But as opposed to the Bechor, where it was sacrificed and the flesh was a gift to the priests, the animal tithe was eaten by the owners, and who could make a feast with their friends. It's not limited to priests eating them. Anyone could eat the animal tithe. Okay, so the Bechor precedes the animal tithe offering because it is sanctified from the womb and is eaten only by priests. And the Gemara challenges this and says, on the contrary, the animal tithe offering should precede the Bechor, as if one mistakenly called the 9th or the 11th animal that emerged from the pen the 10th, then those animals that came out before or after the 10th are also sanctified. Right? When you're counting them, when you pass those animals under the rod, you have to count them carefully, and every 10th animal you put a red mark, say that's the animal tithe offering. But if you got sloppy and miscounted, then you're going to have to designate additional animals, the ones that might have been the actual 10th and the one that you called the 10th, are both going to have to be sacrificed as animal tithe offerings, and that just become consecrated for that purpose. And the Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the Bechor is sanctified from the womb makes it a sacrifice of greater importance than the animal tithe offering. The Mishnah teaches that the animal tithe offering precedes bird offerings due to the fact that it requires slaughtering, right? It's a kosher domesticated mammal, therefore it needs to be shechted, its throat cut and the blood collected through the process known as slaughter, shechting, as opposed to bird offerings, which are killed through malika, which is not the way we normally kill animals. It's only used for bird offerings brought in the temple. So the animal tithe offering precedes bird offerings due to the fact that the animal tithe requires shechting, whereas the bird requires malika. And furthermore, there are two elements of the animal tithe offering that have the status of offerings of the most sacred order. Its blood, which is presented on the altar, and its portions that are burned on the altar. So the Gemara challenges and says, on the contrary, the bird offerings should precede the animal tithe offering, as they are offerings of the most sacred order. There are bird sin offerings, there are bird burnt offerings. Right? When you talk about animal tithe offerings, that's much lower down in the pecking order than a bird sin offering or a bird burnt offering. And the Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the animal tithe is a type of offering that requires shechting makes it of greater importance. Very interesting, right? So the fact that the animal tithe, even though it's a much less important offering than a sin offering, the fact that it is shechted elevates the bringing of an animal offering over the bringing of a sin offering in the form of a bird, because the bird is much lower value. It's much less dramatic, shall we say, not only in terms of visually looking at it or experiencing this happening in the Holy Temple when this happened, but remember that these animals, right, like somebody walked to Jerusalem, maybe walked for 2 weeks, with this animal. Okay, people get attached to birds also, but, maybe we say bird brain for a reason. We're not talking about parrots, and crows and ravens, which are very intelligent animals. But a pigeon, it's just of a lower order than a goat or a sheep. And we talk about it's the shechting that elevates one kind of offering over another, even if it's just an animal tithe offering over a bird, burnt or sin offering. Now, Ravina Bar Shela says, with regard to the sacrificial portions that are consumed on the altar, right, like of a sin offering, a portion is eaten by the priest, the rest is burned on the altar. Ravina Bar Shela says, with regard to the sacrificial portions that are consumed on the altar, sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity that left the temple courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood are disqualified. And the Tana of the Mishna also taught that the animal tithe offering precedes bird offerings due to the fact that it requires slaughtering. And there are two elements of the animal tithe offering that have the status of offerings of the most sacred order: its blood and its sacrificial portions consumed on the altar. So what are we talking about here? The Gemara explains, granted, there are no sacrificial portions consumed on the altar from a bird offering, but its blood at least is sprinkled on the altar. We don't toss birds on the altar pyre, but when there's a bird offering, its blood does go on the side of the altar. Why then does the Mishnah mention the blood? Rather, is it not mentioned in order to teach us that the status of the sacrificial portions consumed on the altar from the animal tithe offering and other offerings of lesser sanctity is comparable to the status of its blood? And that's another reason why we elevate those offerings above a bird offering. Now, the Gemara explains the implications of this comparison. Just as its blood, referred to in the Mishnah as blood before its sprinkling on the altar, as afterward it no longer has any sanctity, so too the sacrificial portions mentioned in the Mishnah are from before the sprinkling of the blood. And the Mishnah calls them, at this stage, offerings of the most sacred order. And therefore, one can infer from this that just as the animal tithe's blood is disqualified by leaving the temple courtyard, so too the sacrificial portions to be burned on the altar should be disqualified if they leave the courtyard before they are taken up on the altar and burned there. Now the Gemara attempts to prove the opinion of Ravina Bar Shela. Let us say that the following dispute between Amoraim, sages of the Gemara, supports his statement. With regard to flesh of offerings of lesser sanctity that left the temple courtyard before the blood was sprinkled, Rabbi Yochanan says that it is fit, and Reish Lakish says that it is disqualified. So the Gemara explains the dispute. Rabbi Yochanan says that it is fit, since it will ultimately leave the temple courtyard, as offerings of lesser sanctity, like peace offerings and thanks offerings, may be eaten anywhere within the walls of Jerusalem, as opposed to the edible portions of sin offerings that have to be eaten by priests in the temple courtyard. Reish Lakish says that even for these offerings of lesser sanctity, if they left the courtyard, they become unfit, as its time to leave the temple courtyard has not yet arrived, because the flesh cannot be taken out until after the blood is sprinkled. And the Gemara infers that these Amoraim disagree only with regard to the flesh of the offering, which will eventually leave the temple courtyard. But with regard to the sacrificial portions of those animals, which are consumed on the altar, and which never leave the courtyard, they do not disagree. As Rabbi Yochanan concedes that if those sacrificial portions left the courtyard, they are now disqualified and should not ascend the altar to be burned there. If they ascend it anyway, they won't come back down for the reasons we discussed in chapter 9, but ab initio, they should not go up, having already left the temple courtyard and been returned. And the Gemara rejects this proof and says, no, the same is true with regard to the sacrificial portions, i.e. these Amoraim also disagree in that case, as Rabbi Yochanan holds that they are fit. And the reason that they disagree explicitly with regard to the flesh that is eaten is to convey to you the far-reaching nature of the opinion of Reish Lakish, as even with regard to the flesh that is eaten, which will ultimately leave the temple courtyard, he says that it is disqualified because its time to leave the courtyard has not yet arrived when they took it out. The Gemara suggests, let us say that this dispute between Amoraim is parallel to a dispute between Tanaim, the sages of the Mishna, with regard to the sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity that left the temple courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood, where Rabbi Eliezer says that one who benefits from them is not liable for misuse of consecrated property, me'ila, because it must mean that they're now disqualified, they're not going to complete their journey, they're no longer sacred, and so if you make personal use of them, you won't be guilty of me'ila. And one is not liable to receive kares for them due to the prohibitions against eating pigul or nosar, or for partaking of the flesh while tameh. All of these prohibitions apply only if the sacrificial portions are otherwise fit for sacrifice. Rabbi Akiva says that one who benefits from them is liable for me'ila, and one is liable to receive kares for eating them due to the prohibitions of pigul, nosar, or partaking the flesh while he is ritually impure. This we talked about a couple chapters ago, that pigul, right, that's if at the time that the animal was slaughtered, a priest had in mind to eat the sacrificial portion that's eaten beyond the deadline, right, on the second day after the night had passed. That renders it pigul right away, and therefore if one then knowingly eats pigul, he's liable to receive kares, or if he does it unintentionally, he has to bring a sin offering. However, that only applies, and pigul, the prohibition on eating something that is pigul only applies if the rest of the offering is brought properly. But when two mistakes are made, it's like we throw the whole thing out, right? Now you don't have those prohibitions because it's unfit in multiple ways. We're at the top of 90a. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara explains, and what is it not correct to say that they disagree with regard to a case where, after taking the portions to be burned out of the temple courtyard, one then brought them back into the courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood? And if so, it is with regard to this very point that they disagree. As one sage, Rabbi Eliezer, holds that the portions are disqualified because they left the courtyard, and the other sage, Rabbi Akiva, holds that the portions are not disqualified simply through leaving the courtyard. But the Gemara rejects this understanding of the dispute. Rav Papa said with regard to a case where, after taking these portions out of the temple courtyard, one then brought them back into the courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood, everyone agrees they are fit. And here they disagree with regard to a case where these portions are outside the courtyard when the blood is sprinkled on the altar. And they disagree with regard to this following matter. As one sage, Rabbi Eliezer, holds that the sprinkling of the blood is not effective with regard to these portions that were taken out of the courtyard, i.e. it does not render them fit. And the other sage, Rabbi Akiva, holds that the sprinkling of the blood is effective with regard to these portions that were taken out of the courtyard, i.e. it renders them fit. And the Gemara challenges, but Rav Papa's statement here apparently contradicts his claim concerning the two loaves brought with the two sheep on the festival of Shavuos. The sprinkling of the blood of the sheep renders those two loaves fit for consumption by the priests. And the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva also applies in that case. And the Gemara explains, Rav Papa is the one who said that with regard to the situation where the two loaves are outside the temple courtyard, when the blood of the two sheep is sprinkled on the altar, everyone, even Rabbi Akiva, agrees that the sprinkling does not render the two loaves fit for eating. And therefore, if one eats them, he is not liable to receive kares due to the prohibition against engaging in pigul, if that was a disqualifying factor, but we're saying there's multiple disqualifying factors, so kares is not going to apply to a pigul violation because there's additional factors that render it not fit. So rather, the Tanaim disagree with regard to a case where one returned the loaves to within the temple courtyard before sprinkling of the blood. And the Gemara answers, this statement of Rav Papa applies only to the 2 loaves, as they are not part of the offering itself. They are their own procedure of Shavuos alone. But with regard to the sacrificial portions, which are part of the offering itself, everyone agrees that they are rendered fit if they are within the temple courtyard at the time that the blood is sprinkled on the altar. And Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva disagree only with regard to a case where they were outside the temple courtyard when the blood is sprinkled on the altar. Got very technical in those last few paragraphs, but I still want to remind us of the lesson we learned initially, because that's a really important takeaway from this stuff, that things, and it was a quick discussion of Mishna number 1, that matters which occur every day take precedence over less frequent matters. So the daily is more important than the weekly takes precedence over the monthly takes precedence over the annual, right? So in our spiritual lives, as we develop a spiritual practice so that we can grow, and blossom into the men and women that we aim to become, fully realizing our mission in this world, that daily practice takes precedence when you have to do 2 things in one day, the daily and the weekly. The daily comes first. We should, let that teach us how important daily practice is. Okay, I'm just getting one comment from Lucy. Similarly, the weekly Shabbos takes precedence over any less frequent seasonal festival except Yom Kippur, and that seems to be the same principle. Exactly right, Lucy. That's exactly right. That's what I've got for us today. And a reminder, no class tomorrow. It's my travel day, and with God's help, we will resume on Thursday, regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night, have a great tomorrow, and look forward to being with you, God willing, on Thursday.